Hello, welcome to the interview about mind hacking and bioethics. My name is Kristen, and I have the privilege of interviewing Dr. James Giordano today. The goal is to promote world peace and have an abbreviated version of these topics. I would like to read his list of accomplishments and credentials. It's quite long, and it's an impressive list, so please bear with me. Dr. James Giordano is a professor of neurology and biochemistry and chief of the Neuroethics Studies Program and Neil Pellegrino Program in Brain Science and Global Law and Policy at Georgetown University Medical Center. He chairs the Neuroethics Program of the IEEE Brain Project and serves as an advisor to the Neurotechnology Futures Project of the Global Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. He is a distinguished visiting professor of brain science, health promotions, and ethics at the Coburg University of Applied Sciences, Coburg, Germany. Previously, he was Fulbright Professor of Neuroscience and Ethics at Ludwig Maximilians University, Munich, Germany, and an Associate Fellow of the Center of Neuroethics at the University of Oxford, UK. He has served as an appointed member of the Department of Health and Human Services Secretary's Advisory Council for Human Research Protection, as an appointed member of the Neuroethics Legal and Social Issues Advisory Panel of DARPA, and as a Senior Science Advisory Fellow of the Strategic Multilayer Assessment Group of the Joint Staff Pentagon. His recent publication, Neurotechnology and National Security and Defense, Political Considerations, Neuroethics Concerns, is regarded as one of the leading books addressing technical and ethical issues and problems in this field. The book is available on Amazon. In recognition of his work, he was elected to the European Academy of Science and Arts and was named an Overseas Fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine, UK.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you for all you've done.
Oh, my pleasure. It's a real honor.
Yeah. Well, I'm honored and just grateful you're here. Starting off, would you please tell me what these mind hacking tools are? Some call them Neuroweapons or Psychotronics. They seem to have several names, but mind hacking seems to be a name that speaks to a large public. And is this like an event or a type of assault that happens often, or should we expect this in the future?
That's a very, very good question. So I think it becomes very important for your listeners to understand the categories of what we're dealing with here. There's a couple of different ways that one could use a technique or a technology to gain access to the brain space. And of course, the brain space and its functions are considered to be mind. But if you think of mind, there are really a couple of different dimensions. There's my thoughts, and all of my thoughts are also flavored in many ways by my emotions. Thoughts and emotions, but they really are sort of part of the same. I mean, it's sort of like the ice cream sundae. I mean, what part is ice cream, what part is chocolate? That's what makes this sort of sundae sundae. So you get cognitions, emotions, and then cognitions and emotions feed into decision-making, and then ultimately decision-making feeds into behavior. Of course, people react to their behaviors in terms of what happens to them. So there's a couple of different ways that you can gain access to the brain space and its functions. One is just by assessing the brain, getting some insight to what it is that people are thinking about, perhaps some insight to their emotional content, and how's that registering on the brain. What you're really looking to do is you're looking to get a pattern of certain brain nodes and networks that are active when a particular individual is thinking certain things, feeling certain things, and behaving certain ways. But then once you get an understanding of that, you then be able to access the brain space itself to affect the way those nodes and networks function and interact with each other. So you see one form of hacking, which can be considered to be assessment hacking, which sometimes is thought to be a form of mind reading, which is not exactly correct. It's really more like being able to develop patterns of brain structural functional activities, and as a consequence, making certain deductions about what brain areas are active when people are doing what. But then those same understanding of those brain areas can be used as viable points, access points, modes, vectors, if you want to speak in military terms, targets, that could then be affected through a variety of different means. They can be very, very crude ways. Literally, I could hit you over the head with a stick, and that would affect your brain. But ever more what we're seeing is that many of the technologies allow for a lot more subtle and somewhat more sophisticated access to the brain, and to be able to affect with relative specificity certain nodes and networks in some cases, and in other cases with no specificity at all, just affecting the entirety of the brain space. So what kind of things can do that? What kind of things can access the brain space in that way? Well, certainly we know that the brain is sensitive to a whole host of different energy dimensions. Electricity, magnetism, and even forms of radio frequency can affect, if not directly the brain space, indirectly the brain space by changing, for example, vibrations, sympathetic movements, cavitation of fluids within the skull, and ultimately perhaps within the brain space. Clearly, we also know the brain is also very sensitive to pharmacological manipulation, drugs. And although many drugs are regulated by the International Biological Toxins, Weapons, and Chemical Weapons Conventions, what we're seeing is that very, very low doses of drugs sometimes are not. Certain drugs that are used for medical purposes can then be delivered to have what we call extra medical purposes. And in some cases, what we understand is that drugs are being developed anew, or they're being linked to certain forms of pharmaceutical delivery vehicles that allow the drugs to get into the brain space. And as a consequence, these things were not revered as biological weapons before, chemical weapons before, but we may have to consider them to be biochemical weapons now. And of course, the issue then is also, I think, very viable, whether or not these devices are actually considered to be biological weapons. And there has been some ongoing discourse in international forums, most notably the 16th Review Conference of the Biological Toxins and Weapons Convention, where a group of very concerned scientists called the Australia Group proposed that we should now begin to consider more and more technologies and neuroengineering devices to be at least viable, if not of real value and operational use as weapons. So those are the types of things that are out there. A number of different countries certainly are involved in at least considering the viability for these neuroengineering devices or mind hacking devices to be weaponized. The United States is one of them. Some of our NATO allies are also considering the viability of these things in use. If nothing else, just to consider what else is out there. We know that these weapons were very strongly explored, in some cases developed by the former Soviet Union, and many of those technologies are retained now within Russia. And of course, we know there's a large program for the development of weaponizable brain sciences in China, Iran, North Korea, Israel. So what we're seeing is that more and more the brain sciences are an international affair. They're an international endeavor. They're being used for direct medical purposes, and they're being duly used for non-medical purposes. And in some cases, they're being directly used for what we call WINS, which is warfare, intelligence, and national security purposes.
Oh, wow. That's the most exciting news. So since governments and global government, governments all around the world are using these weapons, do they target just military, or do they target individuals or groups of people, or who exactly is their target to influence?
That's a great question. So what we're seeing is that although these weapons can be used in ways that are called kinetic, in other words, they can be used for warfare purposes, these really are not weapons of mass destruction. They're really more instruments of specific and mass disruption. So the goal in using these types of tools, I call them tools because they're tools for engagements, important point, they're not actually warfare engagements. So they're existing below the threshold of what would be considered classifiable as a warfare act. These are called non-kinetic engagements. So characteristically, what they'll do is target a group of either specialized, very specific and particular individuals, or target a group of individuals who may be a broader group, not necessarily so specific because of their identity per se, but because of their role. They're doing something, and as a result, disrupting those individuals' function would then incur ripple effects at a variety of different levels. It could be within those individuals' families, within those individuals' workspaces, within those individuals' job and occupational parameters, and or those kind of things that ripple more widely in ever widening circles in a variety of different domains, in some cases occupational, in some cases political, in some cases both. So in terms of if and how these things are being used, there was quite a bit of experimentation back in the middle part of the 60s, 70s, and early 80s.
Wow, that long ago.
Whether or not, trying to determine whether or not these things were viable weapons. And again, they're not very good effects of mass destruction, but they can be very good as a disruptive element. And again, where you want to cause that disruption, I think, is really critical on who you're looking to disrupt and what you're looking to disrupt. So the idea of using these types of devices to disrupt an individual or select group of individuals, so that by changing their behavior, by changing their cognition, by changing their capabilities, you then change whatever the job is that they're doing, or in some way the people or individuals or groups that are reliant upon them, what you're really doing is you're putting into motion something of a domino effect. Now, of course, the other issue is that by using these things in non-kinetic ways, you can also build into that equation what's considered to be intentional ambiguity. In other words, this is not overt. This is not like hitting somebody over the head with a hammer. The more subtle effects, and as a consequence, attribution becomes difficult. It's difficult to find a, quote, smoking gun, so to speak. In some cases, it's pretty evident, but in other cases, it's not. Over and over again, we've been hearing over the past couple of years about the events that happened, for example, to United States diplomatic personnel in Havana, Cuba. Let me be very, very clear. We actually do not know what happened there. Something happened. We know these individuals had rather profound physiological effects that were testable by objective methods. We know that many of the effects are persistent. And my job a few years ago was to try to determine what kinds of things could do this. The problem here, of course, is there was no smoking. There was no proverbial entrance or exit wound. We have a group of individuals who presented with signs and symptoms that were across a spectrum of effects that would be suggestive of, looked like some kind of a head trauma, but they had no head trauma. So then the question was, what kind of things could do this? Could drugs do it? Could electromagnetic pulses do it? Could some form of microwave energy do it? And there's a lot of things that could do it, but then you have to start ruling certain things out based upon circumstance and setting. And so that's really where we're at with the whole issue of Havana. There are those who think that perhaps there's really nothing happened, and this was a form of, quote, mass hysteria, or what they call functional neurological defect. That's difficult to reconcile given the people who were involved and the extent of their involvement and the way that they presented. But again, I want to be very, very clear. We really don't know what happened there, or at least I really don't know what happened there. So the idea that these things are being used, I think there's some suggestion. I think that there's certainly possibility that they're being used. The particular targets are exactly that. If they would be particularly targeting key individuals, I think the individuals would need to be in a role where affecting these people's function would be highly influential to some ripple effect to then have disruption and a variety of different chains of manifestation. That's the best I could give you on that. In terms of whether or not these techniques and technologies are being randomly used against the population, you know, these are interesting political times. If we had had this conversation, I think a few years ago, I would have relative certainty to say absolutely not. And the reason I'm even hemming and hedging the bets is that, you know, I've moved out of those circles whereby I'm not working directly with the government in those capacities any longer. My role working with the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment Group at the Pentagon over 2016. And I think the issue here is some of the channels of communication are not as open as they once were. And again, I'm not making any political statement one way or the other. I'm just stating it would be difficult for me to, let me retract that. To the best of my knowledge, selective or non-selective targeting of U.S. citizens by a U.S. entity is not within the operational framework. That doesn't mean that these things couldn't happen. That doesn't mean that the use of these particular devices, tools, techniques on U.S. shores or against U.S. citizens is an impossibility. That doesn't mean that at all. But if we take a look at the programs of research that occur in the Department of Defense, these programs of research have learned a lot of lessons coming from the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. And I can tell you as someone who served on human protections committees that the necessary hoops that one would have to jump through with regard to institutional review boards and subject safety within military operations to do that kind of research are extensive. Selective or non-selective targeting of the citizens in the U.S. population is just not something that's on the books. The fact that certain military personnel or intelligence personnel have been used as subjects in those types of medical and or military ordnance type of experiments, well, that happens frequently. And realistically, we know that since the 1960s or at least 1970s, do not and cannot happen without the individual's informed consent. Of course, the question is how informed can they really be? And this is still an ethical question and a practical question as well, because if this represents new techniques and new technologies, we really don't have an understanding of the medium and long-term effects. But to get the more grounded question, who's being targeted and why, or are people being targeted and why? To my knowledge, there's no program or project that would provide a mechanism, vehicle, intention, or rationale for organizations and institutions with the United States government to target our own citizens. Again, that doesn't mean that United States citizens are not in some ways targeted or affected by these things. And of course, one of the things that concerns us is that these devices are not terribly complicated to either construct or to acquire. And so the question then is, are non-state actors having access to this? Is there a build-it-yourself community? And I'm not in any way impugning the do-it-yourself scientific community. Sometimes identify themselves as, quote, biohackers. 99% of the time, they're performing sound science, good science with review, and they're self-policing. But it also is a penetrable community in that individuals who may have some capricious, nefarious intent can influence certain individuals, if nothing else, by just supporting the kind of things that they do, supporting their buying equipment of reagents and so forth, and as a consequence can exert subtle or tacit effect on what's being done. So we know that the do-it-yourself community is in some cases warned to be very cautious about who sponsors their work, who directs their work. But I think that the larger concern here is that there may be state or non-state actors who may have access to these types of devices and tools, and or may be making them themselves, or in some cases acquiring them through state sources and other sources. And these can be used somewhat more clandestinely, a variety of different levels. But again, I think that that's a real concern and one we have to be cautious about.
Thank you. And where would be the best source to find evidence of this technology or learn about it? Would it be like the Patent Office or the National Institute of Health?
Patent Office is a good place to start. Anything that's filed under the neuro device head as patentable devices needs to be listed there. You can certainly cross-list with the FDA under their neurological devices heading. That office is run by Dr. Carlos Pena. And of course, anything that is going to be commercially offered that goes to the FDA has to meet FDA criteria. This is used to diagnose or treat a medical condition or non-medical condition. And then in that case, there are specific characteristics, qualities, and criteria that the manufacturer has to then adhere to. Certainly that's the case within the United States. It's also the case within any product that is directly sold, legally sold within the United States, has to meet FDA clearance or the clearance of an organization that is similar, but not identical to the FDA from their home country, that then provides some clearance with regard to what's going on here in the United States, get FDA clearance approved. But Patent Office also, and let's face it, I mean, the internet is a wonderful resource for a lot of things. The only thing I would be cautious of is that there's a lot of misinformation on the internet as well. And so getting a bead on what it is you're looking at, I think it's important to understand, well, what's real and what's not. Another really easy way to figure out what might be there, even as a possible device that individuals could get their hands on that they could modify, is simply look up electromagnetic and or directed energy devices that are for sale to the general public. And, Kristen, these things are available to the general public. These devices are used with relative frequency in Europe and elsewhere to repel vermin, anything from the size of an insect to a small mammal. And what they do is they produce some form of directed energy, whether it's sound or an electromagnetic pulse, that is very uncomfortable to whatever vermin that is, whether it's insects or mammals. And as a consequence, it can be used as a vermin repellent. And you can buy these things over the internet. But as you'll note, when you go to these websites, they're also talking about how to use these things to repel house intruders. And they're not talking about animals. They're talking about human animals.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
the idea there is that, it doesn't take a lot of imagination or creativity for someone to say, all right, I'm going to buy a couple of these devices and jerry-rig them, engineer them, hack them in such a way as to make them weaponizable or to make them affect other individuals in ways that are burdensome or harmful. It'd be like me going and buying fireworks, point the fireworks at someone, or like get a bunch of them and take them all together and turn fireworks into something that's like a bomb. So again, I think there needs to be a lot of caution as to what's out there and what it's being used for. And certainly both my group as well as some of the groups that I work with in terms of policing this type of thing and governing this type of thing have been looking to those device manufacturers and the direct-to-consumer market in terms of what's being sold, how it's being sold, how these things are then being modified after they're sold, and what the potential use and misuse of these devices is and could be.
Thank you so much for that answer.
Sure.
As far as case studies, I mean, the most, I guess, famous one recently that has been in the media has been the Cuban incident and the Chinese. Are there any others, or is there anything else you'd like to add about that case study?
Well, again, to some extent, I can only tell you what I know, because when I was brought in from the Department of State to do some of the work with the individuals who were affected in Havana, it was a rather limited dossier that I was given access to. And what I was asked to do was quite simple. It's something which is called deductive forensics. So given that, you can deduce certain things. You have X, Y, and Z as effects. Now deduce what could have happened. And the actual process by which we go about this is called abduction, A-B-D-U-C-T, abduction. Again, I was not asked to say what happened here. I couldn't do that. I was not asked to definitively provide information that would be held as sort of sacrosanct. What I was asked to do is to develop a set of probabilities, possibilities and probabilities based upon the information that I was given and that was at hand at that time, which was in 2017. And then to work with certain colleagues, both those colleagues who had directly interfaced with the patients by virtue of their examining neurologist, and another colleague of mine who would work to develop various models for what types of things could produce certain effects in different types of tissue. And then again, to come up with a range of possibilities and then assign to those certain probabilities based upon the host of findings that were presented. So that's what I was asked to do. I was not participatory in the incident in China, so I know nothing about that. There have been some other cases where individuals seem to have been subjected to some kind of energetic device, and sometimes it was accidental. For example, these kind of vermin repelling devices, somebody didn't know they were on, and as a consequence, they were affected by that. In some cases, individuals were exposed to very, very low levels, in other words, low concentrations of frequencies of sound that have been disruptive for them, not necessarily in an intentional way, but in a non-intentional or accidental way, but clearly it's the same type of thing. But let's go back to the Havana case, because I think people are really looking to the Havana case as something that's a prototype. I want to be really emphatic. I don't know what happened there. My speculation as to what could have happened there is just based upon what kind of things pathologically happened to the individuals that we saw with regard to their neurological and cognitive function. The scenarios that led into that, so what you're really doing is you're putting pieces of a puzzle together and saying, well, it could be this or it could be that. So that's what I have for you. There are examples in the older literature, some of the old Soviet literature, some of the US literature, looking at directed energy devices and what kind of effects they have on various substances and various tissues with animal models and so forth. But as far as new or what we call emergent cases, nothing that's come to my attention. Now, that said, what has come to my attention is that since some of this stuff in Havana has come to the fore and certainly has been popularized in a variety of different ways. And what I mean by that is getting to the popular media, not just the restricted media within the Department of Defense or Department of State. So it's sort of out there. A number of people have come forward and have told me and others that they have similar effects and that they're having similar manifestations and they have similar problems. And they very often pose it as a question: is it possible that I was subjected to this or that or the other thing? You know, it's not impossible. That's probably the best answer I could give. I'm not in a position to examine these people. In some cases, I've tried to make a referral. Have you seen a neurologist? Have you seen a neurological ear, nose, and throat specialist, for example? And in some cases, we've made a local referral where the individual was seen by people who either I know directly or people who I trust and who I know are working sort of to be on the cutting edge of the field. But my advice is for someone is if in fact they feel that they have been subjected to this type of thing, certainly seek medical attention. Number one. Number two, document when it started, how it started, the manifestations, what subjective and objective features you're experiencing. Does it wax and wane? And then at that point, information is power. I think it becomes important because then it can help any examining physician to get a better feeling for what's going on and make the necessary referrals, what I would call up and down the referral chains. In other words, very often here in the United States, as you know, we begin with a general practitioner, internal medicine, a family medicine physician, and then that person would have to have some insight as to what's going on and then make the necessary referral characteristically to a neurologist or a neuro, ear, nose, and throat specialist. And that would have to be an individual who's also at very least aware of, if not sensitive to, the possibility that these types of devices are out there and people may have either accidental or perhaps even in some cases intentional exposure. The thing you don't want to do is have somebody just pass it off and say, number one, it's nothing, and number two, simply to ascribe it as something psychiatric. Now, let me be very, very clear. I mean, in some cases, there are psychiatric manifestations that go along with a neurological injury. Loss of cognition, change in emotional patterns, change in sleep-wake cycles. This is a neurological issue. So it becomes very, very important to understand what the basis is, what's going on here, and what the possibilities are for its cause. So I would certainly advise anyone who thinks or feels or knows something is wrong and they say, okay, it was fine, now it's not, and they feel that they have either intentionally or unintentionally been exposed to such types of devices and or effects, to seek medical attention.
So how does a doctor feel taking in patients like this, either on a single individual level or on a case study, knowing that these individuals had potentially had invisible ammunition aimed at them? Does the doctor fear for their selves as well, that the weapon could be turned back on if they were to be followed to the doctor's appointment?
No. What I'm implying from what you're saying is that the weapon, that there's something that the individual is housing within them that can be activated, which would then render that individual to be weaponized, right? So I go to my physician, I feel that I've been exposed to this type of thing. Am I now putting my physician at risk because, for all intents and purposes, I am the weapon? Is that what we're talking about here?
Well, I have been diligent and gone to the patent office and seen that biological systems, there's tracking systems for human beings and animals. And these systems can be used for various purposes of, and shoot invisible ammunition at someone as an electromagnetic or acoustic. And how do you determine when the person is in the tracking system and when they're not? Is that?
So
okay.
To the best of my knowledge, and I am just one person. I mean, so please, I really want to state explicitly, I don't know everything. I've been doing this for a long time, but I don't know everything. But the way that these devices work, the majority of them are probably no bigger than, hold on, let me show you. They're about this big. which is not big. I mean, you can conceal a device like that. There's a lot of different ways one can conceal a device like that. Anything that is larger that's going to deliver any kind of energetic is going to require a much larger device. Something about the size of the cover of a garbage can that characteristically has a cone in the middle of it, so you'd have to direct it at a distance. The majority of these devices are not used long distance. They're used at very, very short distance. Even those that are commercially sold, for example, to repel vermin, the vermin has to get near to it. Now, you can increase the effectiveness of this by using more than one device and putting them in a variety of different patterns. Usually it's a semi-lunar pattern, a semicircular pattern. So what you're doing is you're bringing all the energetic waves together to bear at a particular point, and that's going to be what's called a high threshold vector. So that you could do that, but there's no mistaking there's a bunch of these devices. So the take-home message here is that, to the best of my knowledge, these devices are most effective at relatively short range. We're talking probably about 3 to 5 yards. And the individual has to be within the beam or in the relative array of the energetic pulse. They cannot be done at long distance that I know of. The devices that could transmit things at a long distance, there's no mistaking what's going on there. I mean, you'd have to mount this thing on top of a truck. So it's not that clandestine. The clandestine use of these devices involves smaller devices that characteristically work at shorter ranges. And the reason there is, again, you're looking for a disruptive effect to an identified target within a particular geographic or a particular architectural locale. So if you have an individual where you know they're going to be at place X at a given time, or you have control of what that space is, you could in fact be able to create an energy field of a variety of different types of energies that could affect the individual in a variety of ways. And if you look at the animal experimentation work, that's exactly what they did. I mean, if you move the animal outside of the relative energy field, then the animal is no longer susceptible to the effects. So it's not a question of these things going long distance. Again, the things that I'm aware of and things that I've worked on, in terms of understanding how the technology works and what kind of ethical issues go along with that and who's done what with regard to the field. Now, the other question comes up about implantables. So as you know, I mean, certainly a relatively copious presence on the internet, a lot of what I do on the medical side deals with deep brain stimulation for the treatment of things like movement disorders and impulse control disorders, psychiatric type of disorders, and increasingly now we're looking for things like certain forms of neuropsychiatric conditions like eating disorders, etc. This is still, in many cases, experimental for those other uses, certainly for the use to control certain signs and symptoms of Parkinson's disease, dystonia, essential tremor, Tourette's syndrome. This is a fairly well-established therapy, and the techniques and the technologies are getting ever more sophisticated here. The use of multiple electrodes, closed loop systems that are able to be interactive, for example, both open and closed loops, some that are actually accessible through app programs where the user can control the onput and offput of the device and the relative frequency or level of stimulation by virtue of an app. But these are indwelling. This is a neurosurgically implanted device, and it's not an easy implantation. I mean, the individual has to be held in something called a stereotactic instrument, which keeps their head very, very still. The exact coordinates of where this has to go to a person's brain are highly specific. Those coordinates are derived based upon serial forms of neuroimaging, and then the electrodes themselves are neurosurgically placed. And then, of course, what has to go along with that is that there's a lead wire that goes from the electrodes or from the controlling device down to a battery pack. And ordinarily, the battery pack is put in what's called a subclavian space, which is right by the top of the clavicle. And then it's turned on. And it has to be turned on both during the neurosurgical intervention to determine that it's going to get an effect. And then very often what will happen is you see an additive effect with time as the patient recovers. We're not at the stage we can implant things in people's head without them knowing it.
That's good to know. Yes.
Now, I'm not saying that things are not being planted in individuals' heads against their consent.
Okay.
Because there has been some concern worldwide that these types of approaches and techniques might be used as something called neurocorrectives. In other words, if you have an individual who's exhibiting certain patterns of thought, emotionality, or behavior, could we use these types of techniques and technologies to modify their behavior? So let's just say an individual was recurrently violent, who was a criminal. And my own group has actually explored the possibility of, well, is this safe? Is this effective? What are the ethical issues? What are the legal issues, both constitutionally here in the United States and extra constitutionally worldwide? What kind of things we need to worry about? But we're not at that stage yet that I know of. There's been some talk about this, and there's, I think, continued discourses about it. But certainly in the United States, this is not something that's moving rapidly towards fruition. There are discussions about whether or not various forms of neurologically delivered drugs and or these devices could and should be used in certain cases of retributive justice. So in other words, individuals who are recurrently violent, both on the outside and in prison, can we use these to control behavior? And what does it mean if we get their consent to do that? Is that explicit or implicit coercion? There's a whole bunch of issues that go along with it. Virtual minefield, or at very, very least a field that's laden with tripping hazards. Each and all of those have to be considered. But to cut to the chase once again, to go back, there's nothing that exists now that can be implanted or embedded in someone's brain that they would not know got in there. It has to go in there through a neurosurgical procedure, although there is some work underway to assess whether or not we could use a variety of other materials that could be taken up into the brain space without a neurosurgical intervention or with a minimally invasive intervention. Those are in the very, very early stages of what we call discovery, not even development. And the techniques and technologies right now are so immature that we're only beginning to get some insight into what might be possible with animal models or with computational simulations. It's certainly not ready for prime time in human use. So take heart.
Excuse me?
So take heart.
Take heart, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
I enjoyed that. Thank you. As far as ethics and regulations are concerned, is there anything the common person can do to get involved, or what's in place to keep us safe, and just your recommendations?
No, it's a very good question. So any research that's conducted at a university, an experimental laboratory, has to be conducted under the public health system and the Department of Health and Human Services provisions for responsible conduct of research. And again, to give the viewers a little bit of background, a lot of that grew out of what's called the Nuremberg Code. As you know, at the end of World War II, many German scientists and physicians were then put on trial because of abuses of biomedical interventions and experimentation, essentially crimes against humanity. And as a consequence of that, the Nuremberg Code was formulated. And at its core, what it basically says, you cannot violate the autonomy, independence, and will of others for research purposes, or then even for medical purposes, for treatment purposes. And ultimately, the Nuremberg Code was broadly codified into things like declarations of Helsinki, and then ultimately the Belmont Report. And we continue to revise responsible conduct of research in terms of what can and cannot be done, and the need for institutional review boards and consent, and the fact that individuals who do participate as subject in experimentation can voluntarily withdraw without any penalty whatsoever. And these are the types of standards and norms that are established. So the idea of protecting human subjects in research is paramount. And for the most part elsewhere as well. I mean, clearly there are going to be cultural distinctions in terms of the way, even though publics will view institutional research and what the public involvement is and individual roles and involvement with regard to state-sponsored research. But I think that's an international discourse, and it does complicate the issue because not all cultures have the same needs, values, philosophies, and ethics. And so now that much of brain science has become an international enterprise, the need to appreciate different cultures, values, needs, philosophies, and ethics, it becomes ever more important and I think ever more pertinent, particularly as we're beginning to literally trade and exchange what we're doing in the research labs and what we're doing in medicine and development of various products, etc. So this then brings up the question of research tourism. Can I go to another country to do research that I can't do in my own? And medical tourism, can I go to another country to get treated by certain things that are not yet available to me? And things are realities. This is becoming ever more reality nowadays. But I think if you're just looking for those things that are domestic, and what's happening here in the United States, and what role can concerned and informed publics take with regard to keeping an eye on those kind of things, certainly the proceedings of the Secretary's Advisory Committee for Human Research Protections, the SAC-HARP, of the Department of Health and Human Services is, number one, an open forum, so people can actually attend the meetings, and the meetings are well announced in advance. All the proceedings of the HHS SAC-HARP are publicly available, part of the public record. And I think these kinds of things are brought up not infrequently at those meetings. For the rather brief time that I served at SAC-HARP with HHS, there were two instances that came up both in the public discourse and prior to that came up in a closed session that had to do with just these types of things. Individuals who feel that perhaps they were participatory in some research subject, they didn't really understand the full extent of it, or it was a commercial enterprise and the products that were being offered had a research sniff to them. So I think that engaging on that level is useful and important. I think being very aware also of what's being done and the intent and extent of the research that's being done. Again, much of it is complete open access research. And what I mean by that is you can get hold of the medical journals open access. You don't have to pay for them. This is becoming more the norm. But I do recommend that people go to credible resources for that. So make sure that the journal that you're reading is a PubMed cited journal, that it's listed on PubMed, Index Medicus, or Public Library of Science. And the reason for that is many journals out there, some of the journals we call predatory journals, they're not all that good. They publish a variety of things, some that are good, some that are not so good. But of course, the public doesn't necessarily know what the best resources are.
Yes.
So my suggestion would be those resources that are available by Public Library of Science, PLS, PubMed, Index Medicus, and those are the ones that are going to be reviewed, peer-reviewed, obviously, and then maintained at a high standard for the integrity of the research that was done. Also, anything that's appearing in any of those journals has to meet particular standards for the responsible conduct of research to even get published to begin with. And we become ever more stringent and strict about those types of things, because there were some abrogations of those things in the 90s and early aughts, but it's a self-correcting system. That's number two. Number three, I think becoming involved, understanding that public awareness and knowledge and real informed knowledge is really critical, so as to be able to understand what's happening, why it's happening, and what that means. As you can tell from my speech impediment, I grew up in New York City. And when I was a kid growing up, I think it's still there. There was a store called Sims. It was a clothing store. And the owner of the store was Cy Sims, and he had a daughter whose name was Marcy. And they had a commercial. I thought it was a great commercial. They said, Sims, an educated consumer, is our best customer. I like that. I think an educated public is probably the best customer and or the most useful cog in the wheel of understanding what's going on with this type of science and technology. But again, that being educated is important, because I think there are so many resources that are available today that are not regulated, that are not custodial, and anybody can put anything out there. So it's important not only that you read, but what you read, to make sure that it is an accurate representation, because there's a lot of nonsense. And there's a lot of nonsense out there. I mean, a lot of people espouse a particular position, or they'll say certain things. And even within the field of neuroscience, there are individuals who are what we call neurorealists, and they're neuroskeptics. Mm-hmm. And some people think, neuroscience is the answer to everything, and other people think neuroscience is the answer to nothing.
Oh, no.
And again, that's perspectival. So getting an essential balance for someone who is not a neuroscientist to try to figure out what's really going on, it's not easy to do. I think it is important to do, because more and more the neurosciences are having an effect, a manifest effect, not only in medicine, but in public life. And I can tell you, I can absolutely assure you that there's an increased consideration, interest, and ever-progressing developing use of the brain sciences in a variety of countries' national security, intelligence, and defense initiatives. So it's real, it's out there.
Yeah.
And I think being informed and not being misinformed is really, really important.
Yeah, it is important. I don't want to have my thoughts stolen. Nobody does.
No.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, the truth of the issue is we're not quite that level yet. The closest projects that are attempting to do that are the ones that are right now on the drawing board. Again, I'll be totally transparent with you. One of the projects that I'm involved as being one of the neuroethicists who was involved in something of the guidance and oversight is a project called N, as in the letter N like November, cubed, 3 of them, which stands for Next Generation Non-Invasive Neuromodulation. As you may be aware, it is in fact a DARPA project. It's a new DARPA project. And the idea there is to create systems of vast arrays that are implantable in the brain space with minimally interventive methods. So perhaps neurosurgically, but minimally invasive neurosurgical. And that's not an oxymoron. That is a real thing. Not even neurosurgically at all, through the use of modified and very, very newly developed delivery systems that allow materials to then form a relatively vast array within the brain space that can then extract information from the brain space and communicate information into the brain space. When I say that, I have to admit that's about the closest we're coming to something like mind reading and or mind control. And if one makes the assumption that my functions of my brain are my mind, then that's exactly what you're doing. You're reading from the brain space and its functions, developing certain patterns of neurological activity that can then be interpreted in terms of how those patterns relate to patterns of thought, emotions, and behavior. And then I can also modify those patterns of activity in those brain spaces to then change patterns of thought, emotions, and behavior. And the novel dimension of this particular project is that it allows such intervention remotely and at a distance through the use of essentially non-invasive or minimally invasive techniques and technologies. But this is just on the drawing board. The idea behind it is that these types of technologies work rather well for individuals who have profound brain injury, have suffered stroke, for example, traumatic brain injury, individuals who have neurodegenerative disorders. What you're trying to then do is recreate nodes and networks of control in the brain. But let's face it, I mean, as the words come out of my mouth, one could recognize that these exact same techniques and technologies can be used for more capricious, if not nefarious, purposes. And so one has to be aware of the fact that these benefits in terms of how these techniques and technologies could be of great assistance to individuals who have some kind of neurological trauma, who have some type of either congenital or developmentally degenerative disorder that then impairs their function. You can turn them around. So on one hand, you're seeing something that appears to be rather utopian. Wow, I can fix individuals who have a, quote, broken brain. But the exact same tools, if used in different ways, can then be far more dystopian, both in their intent and their effect. And this is something that we really, really need to be cautious of, and as a consequence, develop very strict guidelines for use. But again, now that I've said that, one of the big problems, of course, is who's going to get these goodies? Who's going to develop these things? Yes, we're developing them, but are we developing them in isolation? No, this is not a classified program. This is an open access program. And we know that internationally, the brain sciences are developing at a very, very quick rate. And there's a range of international enterprises in brain sciences. So copycat techniques and technologies that are happening around the world need not necessarily respect intellectual property laws that we have here in the United States, for example. So this is an interesting frontier of developments in the brain sciences that could, in fact, have what I'll call cautionary manifestations. I mean, I don't want to be an alarmist, and I'm not. But I think these are some things we really have to worry about as we look at the potential of what these types of techniques and technologies can evoke.
Thank you very much for that.
Sure.
And what are the deterrents for the for these technologies to be used? by secret government programs. You said in the U.S. we don't, do things against our own citizens, but with the case in Cuba, different governments are suspected. What's set up to prevent that from happening?
Well, in an ideal world, the Biological Toxins and Weapons Convention, Chemical Weapons Convention, and various declarations of Helsinki and other signatory but not necessarily internationally legally binding documents and guidelines. Even the types of substances and instruments that can be internationally traded, for example, in and out of the European Union are regulated to some extent. But a key point there is you have to identify that these things may be contributory to the development of a device or an agent that's going to have weaponizable effect, right? So if I tell you that I'm going to the store and I'm buying fertilizer, and I tell you I go to the store again and I buy ammonia, and then I tell you a bit later I'm going to the store and I'm buying some batteries, you, as an electrical engineer, would say, hey, you're making a bomb. But not everybody would think that. There's nothing wrong with buying ammonia. I'm going to be cleaning my garage floor, or I have pets and I want to clean the pet enclosure. Fertilizer? I'm planting my yard. Batteries? Well, what if the power goes out? I mean, just went out and 72,000 people in Manhattan just last night were without power. They bought batteries. So again, what you're seeing is that the classification of certain things as a weaponizable agent is variable, and the more we're making certain inroads to being able to modify and do things within science, being able to use things like gene editing, for example, being able to use very small scale biotechnologies such as nanotechnologies, the more you're increasing the range of uses that you have with certain things. Again, I think a real concern for what we're talking about has been devices. The reality of it is that devices were really not even on the they weren't even on the palette of consideration for the Biological Toxins and Weapons Convention until quite recently. So some of the work of my colleague in the UK, Malcolm Dando, certainly the work of my group, the work of the Australia group, some of the work that we were doing with the European Union Human Brain Project, specifically the Sub-Project 12 that was tasked with looking at what we call dual-use brain science. I'd like to say was instrumental, if not important, in at least bringing awareness of this to the fore and suggesting particular guidelines, and in some cases suggesting that the existing guidelines are not enough, need to be changed. I mean, some of not, and I don't mean to be bragging my own horn or to be my own horn of bragging, but I mean, this is something that I'm equally worried about, is are the Biological Toxins, Weapons Conventions, Chemical Weapons Conventions, and other signatory treaties enough, given the very rapid growth of the brain sciences, so that the categories that they're using are inclusive enough to be able to then bring these things into the fore and recognize them as weaponizable entities? And the answer is no. So I share your concern that the current treaties may need to be revised in some cases. In some cases, the actual structure of how they classify agents as weaponizable and non-weaponizable may need some revision. And in some cases, categories and actual classifications may need to be developed anew. But the good news is that this is an ongoing discussion and people are taking note of this. Again, I was very enthused by both not only the recommendations of the Australia group, but the reception that those recommendations received and said, yeah, okay, we need to acknowledge this. And I think we're also seeing this across the board with a number of governmental agencies. Certainly I can speak from my own experience with the European Human Brain Project, recognizing the very viable potential of brain sciences to be both directly and dually used. Here in the United States, it was part of the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues that directly identified that brain sciences are in fact dual usable. We penned a number of reports as well as independent think tank reports coming from the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies that looked at neurotechnology futures and the viabilities of these technologies to be weaponized. A very, very good report came out of the Nuffield Council in Great Britain, looking at the viable possible uses and in some cases actual uses of brain sciences and neurotechnologies for national intelligence, security, and defense. And the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, certainly has recognized that the brain sciences have the potential, or in some cases, high probability for use in these initiatives, in some cases as viable weapons by non-state actors or by nefarious states. So I think there's an increased awareness of it, but awareness doesn't necessarily mean action. And even when you have treaties, as you know, treaties are signatory. And just because a nation or a group signs a treaty doesn't necessarily mean they have to ratify the treaty. And even then, even if a treaty is ratified, you then have to ask the question, well, what are the consequences if they don't adhere to the ratification or the signatory affirmation of the treaty? And that gets sticky because now you're dealing with international politics. But I think an increased awareness of the fact that science and neurotechnology can be, has been, and increasingly is being looked towards becoming influential for various aspects of national intelligence, security, and defense initiatives worldwide is a very, very important next step.
I see. Wow, it almost seems like, if people are taking it up for intelligence, I want a piece of it for my own smarts, just to add.
Yeah, I'm not going to argue with that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. And,
Sure.
Yeah. With that, I'd like to thank you all for joining on these topics that are the most pressing issues of our time. Thanks again.
Thank you.